I should say I've got no conflicts of interest with respect to tobacco industry, e-cig industry, pharma or whatever. I'm coming at this from a public health perspective. And I first got interested in this issue when I was Director of Action on Smoking and Health from 97 to 2003. So let me just share my screen and hopefully everything will work just fine. There we go. Okay. That's a bad start. Okay, so let's start first. I mean, it's worth going back to the actual problem that we have here, which is smoking. It's an incredibly damaging habit. You know, affects multiple effects on the body, kills around 96,000 prematurely, and kills more people than all of these other things combined: obesity, alcohol, road accidents, drug misuse, and HIV. It's interesting, it's not quite the same as those other things because it kills people later in life. And typically people, the typical median lifelong smoker loses about 10 years between the ages of 73 and 83. So that's the profile of the harm. It's particularly associated with, can be seen as a condition of poverty. And here we go. Here are smoking prevalence for England. The average is 13, just under 14%. But you can get up to twice that level in some of the worst areas. And of course, as a result of that, you get twice the health impacts. And you see that smoking is one of the most important drivers of not only ill health, but health inequalities. And I'll just quickly go through some examples on that. So this is smoking prevalence, far more unemployed smoke than employed, manual workers than managerial workers, people with poor educational outcomes rather than degrees, and serious mental health illnesses. One of the most serious gradients is in people who have other mental health conditions, schizophrenia, and other psychiatric disorders. And the smoking prevalence goes way up for people with depression, with psychosis, substance use disorder, and also people who live in disadvantaged conditions, homelessness and prisons. So when we talk about smoking, we talk about the kind of people that we're worried about. We're talking about some of the people in the worst conditions in society, some of the most disadvantaged and most vulnerable groups. That's where the smoking is concentrated. Many of us on this call may never see it, but it's out there, concentrated in these subpopulations. One of the things that we do is we put a whacking great tax on cigarettes, and we compound the health inequalities with a super strong regressive taxation. And you can see here the tax breakdown. The pre-tax price for Mayfair budget cigarettes is around £2, but the total price is over £10, of which nearly 80% is tax of one sort or another. So you're spending up to £3,700 a year if you're on a 20-a-day habit, and that's not a million miles away from what you would get if you were on, job seekers allowance. So you can see there that the costs are very material for people who are in a disadvantaged state. So I jumped onto this one, but this is the kind of ultimate theme of what we're trying to get at here. People smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. The underlying drug using pattern, nicotine use. Nicotine's a fairly mild and relatively innocuous drug if dependence forming, but it's not what actually does the harm. In fact, for many people, nicotine may have benefits, cognitively, causing, calming them and so on. But what people die from is the way that nicotine is delivered. And at the moment, it's predominantly delivered by setting fire to tobacco. The nicotine in tobacco is absorbed into the particles of smoke. Thousands of products of combustion are formed in the tobacco coal and then inhaled into the lungs. And it's the products of combustion, or what he refers to here as the tar, that cause most of the serious illnesses, the cancer, the heart disease, the respiratory illnesses, and also the hot gases like carbon monoxide and oxides of nitrogen that are drawn into the body. So this is a key thing to bear in mind as we go forward. There is a distinction between the underlying drug using habit and the means of delivery, which in the case of a cigarette is a very dirty form of delivery system, the tobacco smoke. What we have now are four broad categories of non-combustible nicotine product, okay? And these are, in my view, where this market will head over the longer term, and the reason why we might be optimistic that some of the harms, or much of the harms associated with smoking, will be eliminated. So first of all, you have vaping products, and then you have heated tobacco products. So these are heated products. Unheated, you have these oral nicotine products, and there's been a huge surge in the interest in pouches like Zyn and Velo. So these are nicotine products that you put in your mouth and you absorb the nicotine through the gum, but they're not products that not products that involve any tobacco or smoke. And then finally, traditional smoking tobacco. The Review of Public Health talked about a diverse class of alternative nicotine delivery systems. These are the ones that we've just seen on the previous slide, substantially less harmful than cigarettes. And they say, optimistically, the potential to disrupt the 120-year dominance of the cigarette and challenge the field on how tobacco pandemic can be reversed if nicotine is decoupled from lethal smoke. So that's back to the people smoke for the nicotine and die for the tar. We have an amazing proof of concept here in Europe, which is from one of those quadrants, and it's the case study of snus in Sweden. A snus are these little envelope, these little like tea bags full of tobacco that you put in your mouth between the lip and the gum, and the tobacco is absorbed, the nicotine is absorbed through the oral mucosa into the blood and then into the brain, where it gives the user a hit. So this is the situation about smoking in Europe, okay, the European Union as was. That is Sweden, and you can see it's an anomaly there, and right bang up to date. In fact, in 2020, the smoking prevalence in Sweden is down to 7% current smokers, 5% daily smoking, compared to an average in 2017 of 26% in the EU, and I think it's now down to 23%. So a huge difference in the rate of smoking. It's because people are using snus instead of cigarettes in large numbers. The nicotine use is about the same as the EU average. The smoking rate is much lower. Now that smoking prevalence translates into a much lower rate of disease in Sweden. So this is all-cause cancer mortality. Sorry, I beg your pardon. This is all causes of death in men age 30 and under. And Sweden has the lowest rate. And the reason it does is because more men are using snus instead of smoking. There's an interesting question here about how this works and what I would call the public health mechanism, okay? And so we're looking at the choice that people make between smoking and vaping. And here are some figures from the UK. And you can see we still have nearly 7 million exclusive smokers. We have about 1.6 million people who are exclusive vapors. And then there's about 1.3 million who are somewhere between, okay? 3 million vapors, 8 million smokers. Okay, now the government wants to get to a smoke-free environment by 2030. But it means to below Swedish levels, the Swedish levels that there are now, and it wants to get to below 5% prevalence. So that would be a 2/3 cut from now in the prevalence of people smoking to occur over the current decade. So it's a very ambitious target, but that's what the government's target is. And what I maintain is that they have no chance of doing that without embracing those 4 types of alternative nicotine delivery systems to drive out smoking. You can see that the history of smoking over the last 10 years is this. We achieved about a 1/3 cut in smoking over the last 10 years. Okay, so in the next 10 years, or the current 10 years, we'd have to do twice as well as we managed to do in the last 10 years. So that gives you some idea of the challenge that the government has set itself. How do we know that these products are much less harmful, vaping products in particular? The strongest source of evidence are so-called biomarkers of exposure studies. So you look for traces of toxins in the blood, in the urine, in the saliva, and you find that they're very much lower in people who are vaping or using these other products than in smokers. Okay, so here we go. So you can see this is a study that was done recently by Leon Shahab, who's a brilliant researcher, but he's done these measurements, and you can see that it's a bit difficult to see some of it, but you can see that e-cigarette use is comparable to people using nicotine replacement therapy. And you know, where there are any residual emissions at all, they're also in the background. You know, things like formaldehyde don't go down to 0, they go down to approximately the background levels. So that's what gives us confidence. If there's a much lower level of exposure, we should expect a much lower level of disease. Royal College of Physicians examined this data and concluded, based on the data, that e-cigarettes are unlikely to exceed 5% of the risks of those associated with tobacco products, and may be substantially lower than this figure. And by tobacco products, they mean smoking products. So we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude difference here. However, risk perceptions, i.e. what people think the reductions in risk are not at all well aligned with what you would expect from the biomarker exposure data, and also what expert groups like the Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England say. And Public Health England more or less agrees with the Royal College of Physicians. Okay, and here you can see the orange bars are people who think that e-cigarettes are more harmful or equally harmful. And you can see the number of people who correctly think that they are a lot less harmful, but not necessarily harmless, has been shrinking over time, while the number who think they're equally or more harmful has been increasing, with a particular surge in 2020. And this is data from Action on Smoking and Health, who conducts a survey every year. And the reason for that, I think, is that we had an outbreak of severe lung injuries that gained a huge amount of notoriety and media coverage in the United States, and that drifted across the Atlantic and changed risk perceptions in the United Kingdom. And there was lots of evocative photographs like this. The reality is that that problem was caused by an additive, vitamin E acetate, added to THC, cannabinoid vape pens, as a diluent, as a cutting agent to make the expensive THC liquid go further. It's not actually practical to add that to nicotine vapes, and there would be no point anyway, because you can just dilute nicotine vapes to a desired strength using the standard excipients, propylene glycol or vegetable glycerine. So a problem in the illicit supply chain for THC was blown up into a worldwide, contained mainly within the United States, was blown up into a worldwide problem for e-cigarettes, and that affected risk perceptions, and risk perceptions affect behavior. And it's begun to slow down the rate at which e-cigarettes have been eating into the cigarette market and allowing people to switch from very dangerous to much safer products. It looks exactly like a supply chain contamination problem. There's a pattern of hospitalizations in the United States. It emerged in mid-2019, and by early 2020, it had disappeared again. Okay, so it was something went wrong in the supply chain, the addition of vitamin E acetate, and when the criminals realized what they were doing, recklessly, criminally, they stopped doing it. And then as the supply chain emptied, the problem largely disappeared. Now let's talk a little bit about whether these things really do replace smoking. They do. There's been an excellent randomized controlled trial that showed that roughly speaking, e-cigarettes were twice as effective at helping people quit smoking. But there's more to it than that. That was backed up by findings in the Cochrane Review, which summarizes all the randomized controlled trials, and concluded that these products are helpful at helping people quit smoking. However, the way it works with a randomized controlled trial isn't really that satisfactory, because it takes a kind of equal number of people, gives them these products, whether they want them or not, and sees what happens with them. However, in the real world, the harm reduction implications come from not just the reduced risk, but also the number who successfully switch. And that is a more complicated, that is a more complicated calculation. So first, on the reduced risk, you've got the product toxicity and other risks, the reduced exposure biomarkers and so on that we looked at earlier, and statements from Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England. But on the number who switch, you've got how many try and how many of those succeed. The proportion who succeed, you might get some information from a randomized controlled trial. But remember, the people who try actually want to try. They've opted into using that approach. And therefore, appeal and user choice makes a huge difference in the real world application of this as a harm reduction strategy, rather than a clinical intervention in which you take randomized smokers and you give them something and see what happens. Okay, so I just want you to bear that in mind. In the real world, a randomized controlled trial provides useful information, but it doesn't properly characterize the public health model. The way I look at it is the public health mechanism creates there's a kind of value proposition. It's based on a value proposition about the price, the promotion, the play. Not going to go into this in too much detail, but the question is, why do you buy something? Why do you use it? What are you actually getting from it? And one of the things that people do in tobacco control is to try and degrade the value. So put the price up using taxation. They'll use plain packaging to make the packaging ugly. They'll have anti-vaping campaigns, stop you using it in certain places. They'll make the product less appealing. They'll position it as harmful. They'll use people like medical professionals to tell you that it's a bad idea. What we want to do in tobacco harm reduction is to take an alternative value proposition and enhance it so that the travel from smoking to vaping is made easier. So you have lower rates of tax, more attractive packaging, an interesting product. You're allowed to use it in places where you can't smoke, subject to the agreement of the manager and proprietor and so on. Okay, the problem is what we're seeing in reality is lots of efforts to block that move and to degrade the value of vaping by tobacco control. Smoking cessation, coming back to it, it's not just the randomized control trial data. It is that, but it's also observational studies and also population trends that back it up. We're seeing smoking falling rapidly where vaping is on the increase. It's also user testimony. Lots of people will tell you that after years of trying everything, this worked for them. And actually, it's what you expect. It's a rival to cigarettes, and it's better in many respects, not just in the way that it doesn't kill you to anything like the same extent. It's more attractive, there's less stigma attached with it, there's less smell and so on. Now, let's get into the policy environment. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the problem is here is that regulation is things could go wrong. This is the most memorable quote from that Royal College of Physicians report. And I'm just going to simplify this because it's a bit difficult to read on the screen like this. But what they basically say is that if a risk-averse precautionary approach makes e-cigarettes less accessible, palatable, more expensive, consumer-friendly, pharmacologically less effective, or it inhibits innovation, then it causes harm by perpetuating smoking. And that is what we have at the moment. We have a concerted effort to do all of those things. And the danger is that it will cause harm by perpetuating smoking, by inhibiting a rival commercial value proposition. So, for example, we put warnings on the products that say this is a highly addictive substance. Yet we know that people are worried about addiction when they should really be worried about harm, you know, the cancer and the heart disease and so on. We know from research that the nicotine addiction warning may reduce smokers' willingness to use and try purchasing an e-cigarette, even though cigarettes are just as or more addictive and much, much more harmful. Maybe we should have better warnings. Maybe we should communicate the fact that these products are much safer and give people a steer that this is a good pathway to go down. We also have the youth vaping epidemic narrative. And here I'll quickly go through these. We saw up to 2019 a rapid rise in use of e-cigarettes between 2017 and 2019. It caused basically a moral panic in the United States. But we have to look at that more carefully, certainly more carefully than most of the agencies and commentators in the United States did. I want to just unpack that 27.5% number that we saw in the US, because it has some revealing truths in it. So let's start with 27.5% of US high school students, more than 1 in 5 vaping. Okay, how many of them were frequent and how many were infrequent? Okay, around 2/3 were infrequent users. They're using the product quite frivolously. They're not a particularly high public health concern. They may be using it at parties, blowing big smoke, big vapor clouds or whatever. They are not the problem. Okay, we should worry maybe about the more frequent users. But what if we look at the tobacco use pattern of these users? And here again, we see that most teen vapers, again around 2/3, are prior tobacco users. They're also people who would smoke or be likely to smoke. Now, what if we cut it both ways at the same time? Okay, and here we go. Here's the numbers. Okay, so the people who have never used tobacco and are frequent users are a small number of the total, and you might be worried about them. On the other hand, you never know. They may have gone on to be smokers anyway. The frequent users are mainly prior tobacco users, and vaping may be helping them. Maybe a good news story here, because teenagers also smoke and also are helped by harm reduction strategies. So we've got to unpack those numbers and do the job properly and understand what's really going on with youth risk behaviors. Another thing that we see, and it's an increasing call, Europe's Beating Cancer Plan called for this, the Netherlands have called for it. There's flavor bans appearing all over the United States, all over Europe. It's now a big new move against these products. The problem is that flavors are integral to the value proposition. You know that I showed that 7P's value proposition. Well, the idea that you can get lots of different flavors other than tobacco is really important to users. And here we see the pattern of actual use among adult users, okay? Fruit, chocolate, sweets, desserts, or pastry. By far the most important, this is the United States data, by far the most important products that are used by adults. And that's because they're trying to get away from tobacco and turning their nicotine habit into something different. So the idea of banning flavors is actually another way in which you're blocking that transition pathway from smoking to vaping. What could possibly go wrong, say, with a flavor ban? What are the possible responses to a flavor ban? I'm not going to go into this in detail, but in the mindset of the proposed outcome is that people who like flavors will stop using flavored products, not use any nicotine products, and not adopt any other risk behavior. You know, they'll improve their church attendance, practice the piano, do more homework, or something virtuous like that. Very unlikely. Okay, and here is a quick list just for you to cast your eye over. I'm not going to go through all this, of all the different things that people could do in response to a legally mandated flavor ban. And you can see this in a report that I've done recently, which I will share if anyone wants it. Okay, so basically people can switch to tobacco flavors, switch back to smoking, switch to cannabis use. They can make their own, they can buy on the black market, they can make for the black market and sell on the black market, etc., etc. The idea that people just comply with regulations in exactly the way you want them is literally falsified by the entire war on drugs and the history of drug prohibition, which many people on this webinar, I'm sure, are all too familiar with. Flavors, why do people use them? It's not even the main reason why people use them. The main reason given was I was curious about them. And having a moral panic is one of the best ways of raising curiosity. And it might be that some of the hysteria about e-cigarettes may actually be driving their use in younger people. Flavors was third ranked as a reason for using them. So it's likely that people would continue to use them even if, or do something to work around a regulation that stopped you. Nearly finished now. I just want a final mention of heated tobacco products. Haven't gone into those in much detail, but it's the same broad concept. The main thing that these offer smokers is the experience is much closer to smoking. The tobacco is heated, tobacco-like aromatics are given off. There's a strong nicotine dose from it. But again, there's no combustion. The products, they probably produce more toxins than e-cigarettes for the most part, but far, far less than cigarettes. The big advantage of them is that they may reach smokers who find e-cigarettes unsatisfactory or looking for something different. And these have been fantastically successful in Japan, for example, where we have seen an amazing 40% reduction in cigarette consumption. That's 40% reduction in cigarette consumption over the last 3 years or so. It's absolutely amazing cataclysmic impact on the cigarette trade, which will manifest itself as huge health benefits in the longer term. Again, biomarkers of exposure. The yellow here is people who tried the IQOS, and the green is people who stopped smoking completely. There were smokers, they were all smokers, they stopped smoking completely. And you can see the reduction in these particular biomarkers is more or less the same for someone who switched to the IQOS product and someone who stopped smoking completely. And on the basis of this kind of data, the Food and Drug Administration gave IQOS, the PMI product, a modified risk order, saying that there was a measurable substantial risk in morbidity and mortality was expected on the back of these reductions in exposure. Finally, my final slide, I think, risk proportionate regulation. How should you deal with this? Basically, strong regulation, higher taxes on the harmful products, a much lower and lighter regulation, not no regulation, on the much less risky products, trying to encourage a migration from high risk to low risk products. So to summarize, smoking is the problem. There are now 4 categories of low risk alternatives, and we should be adopting them and using them as public health harm reduction strategy. There's good evidence for reduced harm. There's good evidence for population benefits. You know, people use them as alternatives to smoking, not in addition. This is the direction for the long-term consumer nicotine market. It will ultimately transform into these 4 categories and maybe others, but combustion will be the thing that goes, nicotine will be the thing that stays. And risk proportionate regulation is the way to engineer that transition with acceptable management of risk and opportunity. Okay, and I'm stressing the opportunity here, not just the risk. Unfortunately, a lot of people reject that strategy, and I think they're going for nicotine as a new front in the war on drugs, and that's a tragedy for public health work in the longer term. So with that, I will close, and thank you for your attention so far. We have the rest of the time for questions and answers.